In 1847, at a plantation outside Natchez, Mississippi, an enslaved field worker named Pearl begins collecting cotton bale tags after noticing that names written in a small margin field don't match any planter, gin, or factor on record, but do match people reported sold south and never heard from again. As the harvest runs from August through November, Pearl accumulates 43 tags, each one encoding a different individual who was officially moved through the slave trade, yet appears to have surfaced free in the North. The pattern leads her to a cotton factor named Charles Hargreave, whose Commerce Street operation has been using the bale shipping system, which routes cotton northward to New England mills to move people under falsified commodity paperwork, each name traveling with the cotton until it reaches a contact in Ohio or Pennsylvania. When Pearl discovers her own daughter's name on the 43rd tag, she must decide whether to act on what she knows or protect a silence that has kept dozens of people alive. The overseer has already begun to watch her. The weight of names. The gin house was dark at that hour. The lantern turned low enough that its light barely reached the stacked bales along the far wall. Pearl moved without sound, a habit built over 34 years of life spent inside other people's time. She reached the pressing floor in 11 steps and crouched beside the nearest bale, the one tagged and stamped and ready for the Natchez docks. She did not look up. She did not hesitate. She worked her fingers along the burlap bagging until she found the paper tag, a strip the size of a man's palm, folded once at the corner, and tilted it toward the lantern's edge. The name on the bottom line was not a plantation name. It was not a factor's mark, not a gin operator's number, not anything that belonged in the standard fields of a Mississippi cotton bale tag in the fall of 1847. It was a person's name, a woman's name, and Pearl had seen it before. She had seen it 2 years earlier on a bill of sale posted outside the Adams County Clerk's office on Franklin Street in Natchez. The name belonged to a woman from Dunbar Plantation, 11 miles north along the River Road. A woman sold south that October, reported purchased by a Louisiana sugar factor out of Baton Rouge. A woman who was, by every written record in Adams County, Mississippi, gone. But her name was on a cotton tag, a tag riding north on a bale bound for New England. Pearl pressed the paper flat against her palm. She felt her own heartbeat. She counted 11 seconds of absolute stillness before she folded the tag along its crease and slipped it beneath the waistband of her dress, behind the thick cloth panel she had sewn there in March. That panel already held 31 tags. This would be 32. She was back in the field before the first bell rang at 4:15 in the morning. Solomon Whitfield had owned the acreage outside Natchez since 1829, when his father signed over the deed and retired to town with his second wife. By 1847, the plantation covered 912 acres of bottomland, 3/4 of it planted in short staple cotton, the rest in corn and kitchen garden to feed the 207 people Whitfield kept on his property rolls. The main house was white columned, set back from the road by a 1/4 mile of live oak. The gin house sat behind it, closer to the levee, and it ran from late August through November without stopping. Cotton was everything in Adams County. It had been everything for 30 years. The county produced more cotton per acre than almost anywhere in the cultivated South. and the factor's offices along Commerce Street in Natchez represented a concentration of wealth that most American industrialists in 1847 could not calculate on paper. A planter like Whitfield, shipping 600 bales in a strong year at 11 cents a pound, was moving money that most banks in Ohio would not see in a decade. The trade ran on paperwork, on consignment notes, shipping manifests, insurance bonds, warehouse receipts, and the humble printed tag that went with every bale from the gin floor to the mill floor. A document so ordinary that no one looked at it twice. That ordinariness was the point. Pearl had picked cotton on this ground since she was 9 years old. She had watched 3 overseers come and go. She had seen the gin machinery replaced twice. Once in 1838, when fire took the old press. Once in 1844, when Whitfield purchased a new steam-powered screw press that could finish a bale in 40 minutes. She knew every sound the gin house made. She knew when the steam pressure was dropping before the operator did. She knew which floor planks flexed under weight and which were solid as stone. 912 acres, and she had memorized most of it the way a person memorizes the walls of a room they cannot leave. The tags had always been part of the process. Every bale that left Whitfield land carried a paper tag stapled into the bagging at the upper right corner. The tags were printed in Natchez. A supply house on Canal Street kept a standing stock, and each one had fields for the planter's name, the gin number, the bale's sequential number in that season's run, the weight in pounds, and the consignee. Whitfield used a factor named Charles Hargreave, whose office occupied a building on Commerce Street, 3 blocks from the river landing. Hargreave took 5% of the sale price and arranged all shipping. Down the Mississippi to New Orleans, then by ocean-going packet to New York or Boston, then overland or by coastal rail to the textile mills of Lowell and Providence. In a good season, Hargreaves' office might handle the consignment of 4,000 bales from a dozen different Adams County planters. 4,000 bales, 4,000 tags, each one inspected, bonded, cleared, and shipped, each one traveling north. Pearl worked in the fields 6 days a week and was assigned to the gin house floor on Saturdays, not to operate machinery, but to sweep lint, stack empty bagging, and carry water for the press operators. She was good at being invisible in that building. She had made herself good at it over many years. The first tag she noticed differently was in October of 1846, 11 months before the night she took number 32. She had been stacking empty bagging near the pressing table when a finished tag fell from the operator's hand and slid under the baseboard. Pearl retrieved it. She turned it over from habit. The printed fields were standard. Whitfield, gin number 4, bale 221, 487 pounds. C. Hargreave, Natchez. But below the printed lines in the margin space that usually held nothing, someone had written a name in pencil. A man's name, one she recognized. Boaz. Boaz had been a carpenter at Prentice Plantation, 8 miles east on the Port Gibson Road. He was sold in the winter of 1845, sold south, the word went, to a cane planter in Assumption Parish, Louisiana. Pearl had known his wife. She had not thought of him in months. She did not take that first tag. She replaced it under the baseboard and walked back to her station. For 3 days she told herself it was coincidence, that names were common, that the pencil mark could mean anything, that she was reading intention into ink. On the fourth day, she went back for the tag. It was gone. That absence told her more than the tag itself had. She began paying attention differently after that. Not visibly. Attention on Whitfield land had to be worn beneath the surface, operational only inward. She moved through the gin house on Saturdays with the same unhurried steadiness she always had. But now she was reading every tag she could reach. Most said nothing beyond their printed fields. Most were exactly what they were supposed to be. But roughly once in every 12 to 15 bales, not on any schedule, not in any pattern she could predict, the margin field held a name. Always one name. Always penciled in a small, careful hand. Always a given name only, written plainly, like a word set down for someone who already knew what to look for. She could not read. That was the law and the enforced reality of her life since childhood. But she was not illiterate in the way the men who wrote that law imagined. She had learned letters the way some people learn foreign words, by shape, by sound, by patient repetition over many years, cross-referenced against names she already knew. She could recognize a name she had heard spoken. She could copy a sequence of letters onto the back of a cloth scrap with a burned stick and carry it until she found confirmation. She collected 7 tags by the end of October 1846. She matched 3 of them to people she had heard about. A woman named Miriam from a Faraday plantation sold in the spring. A man called Clem, reported dead at a Carroll County sawmill in 1845. A girl named Temperance, who ran from Dunbar Plantation in 1844 and was said to have been caught and sold further south. She could confirm none of it. But the accumulation of names she recognized, names attached to people who were supposed to be dead or southbound or vanished, carried a weight of its own. A cotton factor's circular she once heard, read aloud in the main house, described the consignment system as the most reliable instrument of commercial transfer in the Western world, a chain of custody so thorough that a bale of cotton can be traced from gin floor to counting house without a single link broken. She had listened to those words and filed them away. Now they returned to her differently. A chain so thorough. A document that traveled all the way north. By January of 1847, she had 19 tags in the panel. She had matched 11 of them to people she believed she knew or knew of. 11 names on documents destined for the textile mills of New England, shipping north on Hargreave manifests, riding inside bale numbers that corresponded to real cotton from real Mississippi fields. She did not yet understand the mechanism. She understood only the direction. North. The confirmation came from a woman named Harriet Odom, who was not enslaved. Harriet Odom was a free black woman who operated a small trade out of a covered wagon. Dried herbs, thread, mending supplies, cheap tin goods, and made her circuit through the plantation roads of Adams County once every 3 weeks. She was 41 years old, had been free since 1831, and carried papers signed by 2 county magistrates in a tin box bolted to the wagon's floorboard. She was tolerated because she was useful and because she was careful. She did not speak carelessly. She did not look directly at men who outranked her in the social geography of Adams County, which was nearly every man she passed on the road. She was exactly the kind of person who could carry information the way a cotton bale carries a tag, attached to something ordinary in plain sight, traveling a route no one questioned. Pearl had known Harriet Odom for 6 years. They had never spoken about anything that could be repeated. In March of 1847, Pearl asked her obliquely about Miriam. Not the woman herself, just whether that name had traveled, whether it meant anything north of the county line. Harriet Odom looked at a point 3 inches past Pearl's left shoulder for 4 full seconds. Then she said, in a voice kept below conversation, "She's in Cincinnati, has been since the autumn before last." That was all. Cincinnati, Ohio, a free state. A woman sold south from a Louisiana-bound sale in April of 1846 was living free in Cincinnati by October of the same year. And her name had ridden north on a Hargreave consignment tag in September of 1846 on bale 221, attached to 487 pounds of Adams County cotton. The mechanics assembled in Pearl's mind over the following 2 weeks with a clarity that felt almost physical. Someone was using the cotton bale paperwork as a parallel transport system. Each tagged bale traveled a legal, documented, inspected route. From gin house to Natchez factor to New Orleans port to Northern ship to Massachusetts or New York mill. The people whose names appeared in the margin fields were traveling a different route, overland, hidden, moved by a chain of contacts. But the tags were their proof of passage. A name on a tag said, "This person was in this system in this season moving north." If a contact at the receiving end knew how to read the margin field, they knew who to expect. She did not know who cut the deals or forged the papers. She did not know who hid the travelers at each stop along the way. She was one person in one gin house, but she understood the architecture of the system the way a person understands a river. Not the water itself, but the direction it runs and where it ends. She began collecting with purpose after March. By June, she had 31 tags. By August, she had 37. She cross-referenced names against her own memory, against things Harriet Odom had let slip in 2-word fragments across 6 months of careful exchange. By September, she had confirmed 7 names. 7 people now reportedly living in Ohio, Pennsylvania, or Illinois, each one officially recorded as sold south, dead, or fled. 7 confirmed. 37 tags. And Charles Hargreaves' office on Commerce Street, Natchez, shipping thousands of bales north each season, every one a legal instrument signed and bonded, and in the margin of certain tags, a name. The most important tag in the collection was number 22. Pearl had pulled it from a bale processed in the first week of September. Bale 94 of the 1847 harvest. Weight 461 pounds. Hargreave consigned. The margin name was Samuel, common enough that she had not initially connected it to anyone. She added it to the panel and moved on. 3 days later, Harriet Odom's wagon came through the back road near the garden fence. Pearl managed 11 words, delivered while examining a loose board. Samuel, a man, sold from Prentice maybe 2 years back. Harriet did not answer immediately. She measured out a length of thread, cut it, folded it into Pearl's hand with the small coin Pearl offered, and said, eyes on her inventory, "He's working a forge in Chillicothe. Has been since last winter. Chillicothe, Ohio. A free man, working a trade." His name had ridden north in September on a bale tagged by the same Natchez cotton broker, as naturally and invisibly as any other word in any other manifest. Pearl counted her steps back to the field house. 44 steps. She counted because counting kept her level. kept her face in the expression required of her during all visible hours. The system worked. The names were real, 37 tags, and the mechanism behind them was functioning exactly as she had theorized, moving people north through the same machinery that had moved them south for generations. She had built her confirmation across 2 failed attempts before this one. The first was a name she had matched to a man from Port Gibson, which Harriet Odom could neither confirm nor deny. The trail was cold, or the name was wrong. The second was a woman Pearl was certain she recognized, whose reported fate in 3 separate accounts contradicted itself so badly that no conclusion held. Samuel was the first clean confirmation she could fully trust. He was alive. He was free. He was working iron in Ohio. By the 3rd week of October, Pearl had 42 tags. The overseer, Rufus Cale, had been on Whitfield land for 7 years. He had not yet said anything to Pearl directly, but his behavior had changed. He was running afternoon walks past the gin house at intervals that did not match his usual pattern. Shorter gaps, unpredictable. He was watching the floor where the finished bales were stacked. He had said something to the gin operator that Pearl could not hear, and afterward the operator moved the finished tag stack to a different position near the press, further from the wall where Pearl typically swept. They did not know what she had, but something had shifted their attention toward her, and she could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. She adjusted. She stopped entering the gin house on days when Cale made his afternoon round. She found new approaches, carrying water for the press operators, stacking empty bagging near the floor drain, staying always in motion, always occupied. The geometry of invisibility required constant recalculation. She had 34 years of practice. But the season was compressing. The 1847 harvest was running 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Steady August rains had brought the bolls early, and Whitfield was pushing the crew through 12-hour days to process the volume before river levels dropped and complicated the shipping south to New Orleans. Bales were finishing faster. Tags were moving faster. In the week she had spent adjusting her routes around Cale's new patrol pattern, she had missed 6 gin house shifts entirely. She was 1 tag away from 43. She had been 1 away for 11 days. Away for... An overseer's log entry from a neighboring plantation read aloud that autumn as part of a dispute over labor quotas contained the phrase, "A quiet worker is either content or calculating." And in my experience, the quiet ones calculating are the ones worth watching. Pearl had heard those words repeated in the yard and had turned them over in her mind for days. She was both quiet and calculating, and she was running out of time to finish the count before someone understood what the count meant. The 43rd tag was in the gin house. She was certain of it. She had seen the stack near the south wall on Tuesday morning. At least 8 new bales finished, tagged, and waiting. One of them, by the frequency pattern she had documented across 11 months, should carry a name. She needed 4 minutes alone in the gin house. 4 minutes without Cale, without the operator, without a reason to be questioned. On Thursday morning in the last week of October, Cale went to the main house at 7:30. The gin operator stopped the press to clear a jammed plate. Pearl had until the plate was free. She moved. The bale was by the south wall. Bale 388, weight 443 pounds, everything printed and standard. Pearl reached it in 4 steps, tilted the tag toward the window light, and read the margin field. She read it twice, then a 3rd time. The name was not from Prentice, not from Dunbar, not from Faraday, not from any plantation she had spent months cross-referencing. It was not a name she had searched for or anticipated finding. It was her daughter's name, Judith, sold in October of 1845. Reported transferred to a factor in Baton Rouge. A buyer Pearl had never seen, a name she had never been allowed to know in full. Gone south. The direction that meant gone forever. 2 years of silence so absolute it had its own weight, its own specific gravity, pressing against every ordinary hour of every ordinary day since. Judith. Written in pencil, in the small, careful hand she had come to recognize across 42 earlier tags, on a bale shipping north. Pearl pressed her palm flat against the burlap and held it there. The gin machinery stood 12 feet away. The steam pressure gauge behind her read 41 pounds. Outside the window, the October sky had gone the color of old iron, the kind of flat gray that sat over the river for weeks at the end of harvest season. She took the tag. She walked back to the field. She did not count her steps. She did not sleep that night. She lay on her side in the dark of the quarters with 43 tags pressed flat against her ribs and her daughter's name on one of them, and she did not allow herself to feel it yet. Feeling was something she had learned to schedule, something she did only when she could afford the weight of it, only when the feeling would not show on her face during visible hours. This was not one of those hours. This was a working hour. It had to be. She thought instead about mechanics. The tag for Judith was dated by the bale number, bale 388 of the 1847 season. The gin house had processed bale 388 on a Thursday in the last week of October. Pearl had been collecting tags for 11 months. In all of that time, she had never found a tag that carried a name belonging to someone still living on the plantation where the tag originated. Every name in her collection of 43 was a name from somewhere else. Prentice, Dunbar, Faraday, Port Gibson, a Carroll County sawmill, a Natchez holding yard. The names traveled on other people's cotton. The names traveled on Whitfield cotton, and Whitfield had 207 people on his property rolls, and not one of their names had appeared in a margin field. Until now. Judith had been sold in October of 1845. 2 years gone. 2 years of a silence so thorough it had become architectural, a feature of every room Pearl moved through, a weight distributed so evenly across every waking hour that she had stopped distinguishing it from ordinary air. And now her name had appeared on a bale tag at the gin house, where she no longer lived, encoded in a margin field by a hand Pearl had not yet identified, destined for a cotton mill in Massachusetts or Rhode Island. Pearl lay still and worked through what this could mean. It could mean Judith was dead and the name was coincidence. She dismissed this in 4 seconds. 43 tags over 11 months. And every matched name had proved to be a living person moving north. The probability of coincidence at this point was not a number she could take seriously. It could mean Judith's name was a retrospective record, that she had already passed through the network, already reached the north, and the tag was a late notation in some accounting system Pearl didn't fully understand. Possible. But in every confirmed case she had documented, the timing between the tag and the confirmed arrival in Ohio or Pennsylvania was 8 to 12 weeks. If the tag was retrospective, Judith had been free for 2 years, and Pearl was only now finding the record of it. That thought compressed something in her chest so hard, she had to press her palm flat against the floor plank beneath her to stay level. Or, and this was the third possibility, the one she kept returning to, the tags were not retrospective records at all. They were prospective signals. The name went on the tag before the person moved, not after. The tag traveled north first, by the legal route, aboard the Cotton. The person followed within weeks, by land, by a chain of contacts Pearl had never seen and could not map. The tag was the advance notice, the system's way of telling the receiving end. This person is coming, this is who to look for, this is the name they're traveling under. If that was true, then Judith's name on bale 388 meant Judith was not yet free. It meant she was in motion, or about to enter motion, within the next few weeks. It meant the window was narrow, and it meant the network around that window was still operating. And it meant that every hour Pearl spent lying still in the dark was an hour she did not have. She sat up before the 3 o'clock bell. For 11 months, she had been collecting evidence of the network's existence. She had documented 43 tags, confirmed 7 names, built a picture of the mechanism that was detailed enough to prove the system was real. What she hadn't done, what she had deliberately avoided, out of a caution she no longer had the luxury of maintaining, was identify who was writing the names. Someone in this gin house was encoding those margin fields. The tags were printed in Natchez at a supply house on Canal Street that Whitfield had used for at least 12 years. They arrived at the gin house as standard blank forms. Between the moment they arrived as blanks and the moment they left attached to finished bales, someone with a pencil and access to the pressing floor was adding 1 name to certain tags in a cycle of roughly 1 per every 12 to 15 bales. There were 4 men who worked the gin house floor with regular unsupervised access to finished bales: the press operator, the gin mechanic, the weighing clerk, and the bagging stitcher. Pearl had eliminated the weighing clerk. He was 17 years old and had been on Whitfield land for only 14 months, well inside the period she had been collecting. But the tags she had found from the season before he arrived already carried names. She had eliminated the stitcher. He worked the final stage of bale preparation, but Pearl had watched him for 6 Saturdays, and he never touched a tag, only the burlap. The gin mechanic was a possibility, but his access to the pressing floor was intermittent. He came when machinery needed adjustment, not on a consistent schedule, which left the press operator. His name was Josiah Truitt. He was 53 years old, originally from Giles County, Tennessee, and he had operated the press at Whitfield's gin house for 9 years. First the old mechanical screw press, then the new steam-powered one installed in 1844. He was a quiet man with a deliberate manner of moving, the kind of economy of motion that came from decades of working machinery that would injure you if you were careless. He kept his tools in a specific order on a shelf to the left of the press, and he became visibly irritated if anyone displaced them. He ate his midday meal alone at the south end of the pressing floor, facing the wall with 15 minutes of solitude that he protected with a posture that discouraged interruption. Pearl had watched him for 11 months, and had never once seen him write in a margin field. She had also, she now realized, never watched him for the 20 minutes after a bale was finished and before it was carried to the stacking wall. She made her first attempt on a Friday morning in late October, positioning herself near the burlap pile at the south end of the pressing floor during the window after bale 391 was finished. Truett ran the press down and reached for his lunch pail. He was 9 feet away. Pearl was stacking empty bagging with her back turned at an angle that allowed peripheral observation. Rufus Cale came through the gin house door at 7 minutes past the hour. He walked the length of the floor without speaking and went out the far door. He was inside the building for 45 seconds. Pearl did not move. Truett did not move. The opportunity closed. She made her second attempt on the following Tuesday on bale 396. This time Cale was at the north field inspecting a fence repair. Pearl had confirmed it from 2 separate people that morning, and the gin mechanic was in Natchez for a parts purchase. She stationed herself at the water barrel near the press, which gave her a reason to be present and a direct sight line to the tag stack. Truett finished bale 396 at 9:15. He recorded the weight, 472 pounds, in his production book. He tore a tag from the supply strip and wrote the standard fields in his usual dark leaded pencil. Whitfield, gin number 4, bale 396, 472 pounds, C. Hargreave. He set the pencil down. He reached into his left breast pocket. The second pencil was shorter than the first. The lead was lighter, a soft gray that Pearl could see even from 8 feet away, barely registered on the paper. He held it for 3 seconds at the bottom margin of the tag. Then he put it back in his pocket, attached the tag to the bale bagging, and called for the carrier. Pearl carried 3 gallons of water back to the press station and set them down without looking at the tag. She had seen what she needed to see. The mechanics of the system assembled themselves over the following 3 days with the same unhurried clarity that had characterized every stage of her investigation. Truett was the encoder at this end, the gin floor agent, the one who received instruction from somewhere above him and translated it into a pencil mark on a 1/4 inch of margin. He had been doing it for years. The question of how long became critical when Pearl considered the tag supply itself. The standard tags used by most Adams County planners were a uniform size, 3.5 inches by 2 inches, with printed fields occupying the top 3/4 and a narrow margin at the bottom that usually held nothing. Whitfield's tags were different. They were the same width, but a 1/4 inch taller, and the bottom margin was proportionally wider, wide enough to accommodate a penciled word without crowding the printed text above it. Pearl had been holding 43 of these tags for months without registering the dimensional difference. When she laid a Whitfield tag against a tag she had salvaged from a Prentice bale in the summer. Prentice used the standard size. The extra 1/4 inch was unmistakable. Someone had ordered custom tags. The only person who ordered Whitfield's tags was Charles Hargreave, whose office handled all of Whitfield's commercial supplies as part of the consignment arrangement. Hargreave had been Whitfield's factor since 1841. The custom tag size, the wider margin, the deliberate extra space, that design decision had been made in Hargreave's office, and it had been made before the first name ever appeared in a margin field. This was not improvisation. This was engineering. Pearl did not know when Hargreave had started the system. She knew only the 11 months she had personally documented. But Truitt had been at this gin house for 9 years, and the custom tag design had to predate the encoding. If the system had been running since 1843 or 1844, which the tag design suggested, it had been operating for 4 years before Pearl noticed it. 4 years of one name per 12 to 15 bales, across not only Whitfield's 600 bales per season, but every planter Hargreave handled. A factor of Hargreave's scale might manage 30 or 40 clients, 40 planters at 500 bales each, 20,000 bales a season. One name per 14 bales, 1,400 names per year. 4 years. The number that emerged from that calculation was not a number Pearl could fully hold in her mind. It was somewhere above 4,000. 4,000 people, possibly more, riding north inside the legal machinery of the American cotton trade. She sat with this figure for a long time. Then she set it aside because the number that mattered right now was one, and that one was named Judith. The confirmation of Truitt's role solved one problem and created a larger one. Pearl now knew the mechanism. She knew who operated it at the gin house level. She knew the tags were prospective signals, not retrospective records. She knew Judith was in the network, moving toward a northern contact who would be watching for her name on a bale arriving at a mill loading dock within the next 8 weeks. What she did not know was whether the network would still be operating in 8 weeks. On the second Tuesday of November, Whitfield's house secretary read aloud in the main yard a list of bale numbers requiring verification against Hargreave's October receipt. It was routine. Whitfield ran a meticulous accounting and checked his gin records against the factor's receipts every season. Pearl was near the garden fence and heard the list without appearing to listen. 17 bale numbers, all standard. Then the secretary added in the same flat, bureaucratic tone, Mr. Whitfield notes a discrepancy between gin record bale 312 and factor receipt 313 and requests clarification. 1 digit, a transposition error, the kind that happened in any high-volume commercial operation and was corrected with a 2-line letter. Pearl filed it and moved on. 3 days later, she was carrying water past the main house side porch when she heard Whitfield dictating to his secretary through the open window. She slowed her pace by 2 steps, enough to catch a sentence without stopping. And in the matter of the tags themselves, my overseer has remarked on certain pencil notations appearing in the lower margin fields, and I should like to know whether these represent a new notation from your office, or whether there has been some error in the tag printing supply, as the markings do not correspond to any standard field in my gin records. Pearl walked on. She set the water barrel down at the press station. She picked up an empty bucket. She walked back to the well. She counted the steps. 38 steps to the well. She counted because if she did not count, the weight of what she had just heard would show on her face. Whitfield had dictated a letter to Charles Hargreave asking about the margin notations. In the language of routine commercial correspondence, politely, with no accusation, he had told his cotton factor that someone at his gin house had noticed the pencil marks that were the foundation of a 4-year operation, moving hundreds of people north. The letter would reach Commerce Street within 24 hours. Pearl had spent 11 months building an archive. She had spent the past 3 weeks working out the mechanics of the system she was documenting. She had never, in all of that time, formed a plan for what to do with what she knew. The plan had always been abstract. Reach 43, find the right hands, pass the archive to someone who could use it. She had not specified the hands. She had not identified the channel. She had 48 hours before Hargreave read a letter that would, at minimum, cause him to suspend the margin encoding on every tag his office supplied. At most, it would cause him to dismantle the entire operation, replace the tag supplier, reroute the shipping manifests, go silent for a season or more. Every person currently mid-transit between a southern sail record and a northern contact point would be traveling without an advance signal. The receiving end would not know who was coming. The chain of custody that moved a person from a Mississippi gin house to a free state in 8 weeks depended on each link knowing the next was ready. Without the tags, the links went blind. Judith, if she was already moving, would be traveling toward a contact who did not know to expect her. Pearl needed to reach Harriet Odom. Harriet Odom's 3-week circuit placed her at Dunbar Plantation, 6 miles north on the River Road, in approximately 2 days. Not at Whitfield. Not close enough to intercept at a fence line or a garden exchange. 6 miles away, and Pearl hadn't left the boundaries of Whitfield land in 4 years. She thought through every person she might trust with a message. She counted them. The number was small enough that she could hold them all in one breath. Of that number, only one had regular movement off the property. A man named Cato, who drove the wagon to Natchez for supply runs on Thursdays. Thursday was 4 days away. 4 days against 48 hours was not arithmetic that worked. She tried anyway. She found a way to approach Cato near the stable that afternoon and said, in the compressed directional language she had been developing for 11 months, 6 words. Harriet Odom, before Thursday. It matters. Cato looked at her for 2 seconds. He said, I don't go before Thursday. I know. He walked into the stable. She did not ask again. The message had not traveled. Thursday was still 4 days away. The letter was still moving toward Commerce Street. That night, returning from the water barrel at 8:30, Pearl took the long path between the garden fence and the rear of the quarters. The route that added 70 steps but passed through a section of deep shadow between the smokehouse and the tool shed. She had walked it hundreds of times. She knew every inch of the ground there. In the dark between the smokehouse and the fence, someone was standing. She knew from the silhouette that it was Rena, the other woman who worked gin house shifts on Saturdays, who had given Pearl that long, unreadable look 6 weeks ago when Pearl asked about Truett's writing habits. Rena was 40 years old, had been on Whitfield land for 12 years, and had said fewer voluntary words to Pearl in those 12 years than Pearl could count on one hand. She was not a woman who stood in dark paths waiting for people. Pearl stopped. Rena did not move. Neither of them spoke. Then Rena pressed something into Pearl's left hand, flat, paper-thin, folded once, and walked on without a sound. Pearl did not open it until she was inside. She angled the cloth panel toward the faint light at the window crack and looked at what she held. It was a cotton tag, a Whitfield tag, the custom size, the wider margin, blank in all the printed fields never attached to a bale, and in the margin in the small, careful hand Pearl had come to know across 43 collected tags, a single penciled mark. Not a name this time, a number, 6. Pearl held it flat in her palm. 6 days, 6 miles. the sixth stop on a route she had never seen. The sixth person in a chain she had never counted. She did not know which. She did not know what language the number was written in, what grammar governed its meaning, what the network used numbers for when names were not sufficient. She knew only that Rena had handed it to her. Rena, who had worked these Saturday gin house shifts for years. Rena, who had said nothing for 12 years. Rena, who was not standing in a dark path by accident. Pearl was not the only person on Whitfield land who had been watching. She pressed the 44th tag into the panel behind her dress, alongside 43 names and 11 confirmed free people, and one name that was her daughter's. And she lay down in the dark and waited for morning. The sixth fence post from the east corner of the gin house was a split-rail cedar post, thicker than the others, that Pearl had walked past 600 times without once stopping to look at it. She knew its position the way she knew every fixed point on 912 acres, not by memory exactly, but by the body's accumulated knowledge of repeated paths. She had been past it with water buckets and with empty hands and in rain and in the flat gray light of pre-dawn and in the full heat of August afternoons. She had never stopped there. Not once. Not until the morning after Rena pressed a blank tag into her hand in the dark. She left the quarters at 20 minutes before 6. The morning was cold. The kind of November cold that settles into bottomland like standing water, low and still and absolute. She carried a water bucket. She had carried water buckets across this ground for so many years that the act itself had become a kind of invisibility. A woman with a bucket was a function, not a person, and functions did not require scrutiny. She walked at her standard pace. She did not deviate from her standard route until the gin house came into view, and then she counted fence posts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. She set the bucket down at the base of the 6th post and crouched to adjust the bale handle. The man standing 20 feet behind the fence in the shadow of the storage lean-to had been there long enough that his breath had stopped misting in the cold. He was still in the way of a person who has learned to wait without displaying the fact of waiting. He was approximately 40 years old, dressed in the rough canvas of a working drayman, with a wagon visible through the trees on the back access road, a flatbed with barrel staves and supply crates, the kind of load that went in and out of plantation properties without generating paperwork. His name was Ezekiel Foote. Pearl did not know this yet. She would learn it later in a different context, in a different year. For now, he was simply the contact, the person the number 6 had promised. He spoke first, in a register barely above the wind in the cedar rail. "You have something that needs to move?" "A letter," Pearl said, "from the main house. Going to Commerce Street today. It asks about marks on the tags." 3 seconds of silence. Then, "How many words does he use to ask?" "Enough to close the road," Pearl said. Foote looked at the access road for a long moment, calculating something she could not see. Then he said, "I'll be at the Commerce Street loading door before 10. He picked up a single barrel stave from the ground near the lean-to. The reason he had come, documented in the supply ledger, irrefutable, and carried it back to his wagon. Pearl picked up her water bucket and walked back to the well. The exchange had lasted 47 seconds. What happened on Commerce Street that morning was never recorded in any document that survived. What Pearl learned over weeks, in fragments, through Harriet Odom and through the compressed vocabulary of 11 months of careful exchange, was approximately this. Hargreave had been expecting the inquiry for years. Not the specific letter from Whitfield, not that precise moment, but the category of event. A factor who ran an operation of that scope and duration didn't do so without preparing for the question that would eventually come. He had prepared for it the way a good engineer prepares for load stress, not by preventing the pressure, but by designing the structure to absorb it and remain standing. The response he sent to Whitfield was dated the same morning as Whitfield's own letter. It arrived at the main house before Whitfield's letter had even cleared the county road. In it, Hargreave explained that the pencil notations in the lower margin of the tags represented a new quality grading system implemented by the Natchez Tag Supply House on Canal Street, a notation indicating the paper grade and print batch, intended for the factor's internal inventory system. He enclosed a printed circular from the supply house, dated 3 weeks prior, explaining the new marking standard in the dry, bureaucratic language of a commercial printer's notice. The circular was a forgery. Hargreave had printed it himself, on supply house paper he had purchased in quantity, with a typeface that matched the real circulars closely enough that a Mississippi cotton planter reviewing it in the course of ordinary business would have no reason to question it. He had held that forgery in a drawer in his Commerce Street office for 2 years, waiting. Whitfield read the circular. He made a note in his records, a single line. Tag notation, quality grading, per Hargreave's letter of November 14th, 1847. He filed Hargreave's letter. He did not write again about the margin fields. Rufus Cale, receiving no follow-up from his employer on the subject, eventually redirected his surveillance toward a different concern: a broken lock on the grain store that had been attracting nighttime attention. Within 3 weeks, the extra scrutiny around the gin house had quietly dissolved. The road stayed open. Pearl waited. She had learned over 11 months that the network's timing was not precise in the way a watch is precise. It was precise in the way weather is precise, governed by real forces operating on a real schedule, but subject to the variables that all human logistics carry. 8 to 12 weeks from tag to confirmed arrival was the range she had documented. Judith's tag had shipped on bale 388 in the last week of October. The gin house season was ending. The final bales were moving to the Natchez docks. Somewhere along a route Pearl could not map, through safe houses and river crossings and free state border towns she had never seen and would likely never see, her daughter was moving north. Pearl did not allow herself to count the days. Counting the days was a kind of hope she could not afford to carry visibly. Instead, she worked. She picked the last of the cotton that remained in the fields after the main harvest. She swept lint from the gin house floor on the last 2 Saturdays of the season. She carried water. She moved through the 912 acres of Whitfield land with the same unhurried, surface ordinary steadiness that had kept her alive and undetected for 34 years. She waited 43 days. On the 14th of December, a cold Tuesday with a hard frost on the field stubble, Harriet Odom's wagon came through the back road near the garden fence. Pearl was there. She had been positioned near that fence at every possible hour for 6 days. When the wagon slowed, she was ready. She moved to the wheel side with a coin in her hand, the appearance of commerce, the cover they had used for 6 years. Harriet Odom measured a length of thread. She cut it, She did not hand it across the fence. Instead, she said, in the voice she kept below conversation, with her eyes on the thread and not on Pearl, "She's in Zanesville. Work in a washerwoman's house on 5th Street. Has been since the 2nd week of November." Pearl put the coin on the fence rail. She took nothing. There was nothing to take. "Is she well?" Pearl asked. "Well enough," Harriet said. "She asks after you." The wagon moved on. Pearl stood at the fence for 11 seconds, long enough to feel the cold of the air and the specific weight of 43 days of waiting finally releasing. And then she walked back to the field house. Judith was in Zanesville, Ohio, 390 miles north, free. The network that Charles Hargreave operated out of his Commerce Street office continued for 14 more years. It ran through the end of the 1847 season, through 1848 and 1849, and the decade of the 1850s, through the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act that made the stakes of discovery geometrically higher, through the Kansas-Nebraska turbulence of 1854, and the gathering pressure of the years that followed. It ran through seasons of drought and seasons of abundance, through price fluctuations that brought cotton down to 7 cents a pound and back up to 13. It ran as long as cotton ran, which was to say it ran until April of 1861, when the first shots of a different kind of American machinery ended the trade that had given it cover. Josiah Truitt, the gin operator, left Whitfield's employ in the spring of 1858, when his eyesight deteriorated to the point where he could no longer safely operate the steam press. He moved to Natchez proper, where he worked as a supply house clerk for 3 years before the war made that occupation irrelevant. He died in 1871 in a rooming house on Pine Street, age 76, without leaving a will or a statement or any document that mentioned the left breast pocket pencil or the margin fields of 412 tags he had personally encoded over 14 years. Pearl counted those 14 years, much later, when she understood the full duration of what she had stumbled into. She had documented 11 months of it. The other 13 years and 1 month had continued above her and around her, and through the gin house she swept every Saturday, invisible in the same way the system had always been invisible, hiding inside a commercial process so routine that no one with the authority to investigate it ever thought to look. Hargreave closed his Commerce Street office in June of 1861. He moved to Cincinnati 4 months later. He had been moving there his entire adult life, in the only way available to him. 1 name at a time, 1 margin field at a time, 1 bale of cotton at a time. He died in Cincinnati in 1889. His obituary in the Cincinnati Daily Gazette ran 41 words. It mentioned his former career as a cotton factor and his long residence in the city's northern ward. It mentioned a surviving daughter and 3 grandchildren. It mentioned nothing else. The suppression of this story was not the work of 1 man or 1 institution or 1 deliberate act of concealment. It was the work of the material itself. Cotton bale tags were commercial refuse. They traveled with the cotton from gin house to mill floor, and at the mill they were removed, logged, and discarded. The mills of Lowell and Providence and New Bedford processed millions of bales across the decades of the antebellum period. The tags those bales carried went into waste bins, into furnaces, into the unremarkable landfill of an industrial economy that generated paper by the ton and saved almost none of it. The document that encoded a person's passage, that carried their name across 400 miles of distance, inside the legal machinery of a trade built on their labor, lasted on average approximately 9 weeks from gin house to mill incinerator. The only archive was Pearl's. 43 tags in a cloth panel sewn into the waistband of a dress. 43 names, 11 confirmed. One of them her daughter. An archive built by a woman who could not read, across 11 months of Saturday mornings, inside a gin house on 912 acres of Adams County bottomland. What happened to those 43 tags is not known. Pearl does not appear in Whitfield's records after the 1847 property roll, a list of 207 names compiled for tax purposes, in which she appears as entry number 74, identified by first name only, occupation listed as field, age estimated at 34. She is not in the 1850 or 1860 census. She is not in the Freedmen's Bureau records that began in 1865. She left no will, no letter, no deposition, no document in any archive that has been located. The 43 tags were never found. In the summer of 1938, a field interviewer working for the Federal Writers Project, the oral history division of the Works Progress Administration, sat in a small house on Vine Street in Cincinnati, Ohio, and spoke with a 91-year-old woman named Judith Holloway. The interviewer's name was Thomas Garrett, 26 years old, a recent graduate of Ohio State, who had been assigned the Cincinnati circuit for 6 months. His notes, filed with the WPA's Cincinnati office in August of 1938, ran to 11 typewritten pages. Most of the interview concerned Judith Holloway's memories of her childhood, her early years in Ohio, her husband's work at a furniture factory, her children and grandchildren. Near the end of the transcript, on page 9, Thomas Garrett had recorded the following exchange. "Do you remember your mother clearly?" "I remember everything about her," Judith Holloway said. "She was a woman who counted things. She kept numbers in her head the way other people keep prayers. She always said, 'Numbers don't lie. Names can be taken from you. Numbers stay.'" "What was her name?" "Pearl," Judith Holloway said. "That's all I ever knew. Just Pearl." The transcript was filed, cataloged, assigned an accession number, and stored in a cardboard box in the WPA Cincinnati office. When the WPA was dissolved in 1943, the box was transferred to the Ohio Historical Society in Columbus. It sat in a storage room for 30 years. In the spring of 1973, a graduate student in history at the University of Cincinnati, named Robert Ashby, was researching antebellum commercial networks in the Mississippi Valley. His dissertation concerned the financial infrastructure of the cotton factor system, the brokers, the manifests, the credit arrangements that connected southern planters to northern mills. He was not looking for the Underground Railroad. He was looking at pricing structures. In the surviving commercial records of several Natchez factors, a partial collection held at the Louisiana State University Archive in Baton Rouge, Ashby noticed an anomaly. The tags used by one factor's clients showed a consistent dimensional variation beginning in the early 1840s. A quarter-inch increase in height, a proportionally wider lower margin. The variation appeared across the records of 17 different planters, all of whom used the same Commerce Street factor. The factor's name was Charles Hargreave. Ashby could not explain the dimensional variation. He noted it in a footnote. 8 months later, reviewing WPA oral history transcripts at the Ohio Historical Society on an unrelated matter, he came across Thomas Garrett's 1938 interview with Judith Holloway. He read to page 9. He read the line about numbers. He read the name Pearl. He sat with that transcript for 40 minutes in the archive reading room. Then he went back to his notes on the Hargreave tag anomaly and began to calculate. 1 name per 12 to 15 bales. 17 client planners. Average 600 bales per planner per season. 18 years of operation, from the first custom tag order in 1843 to the last gin season of 1860. He ran the arithmetic 3 times. The number that emerged, the range at the lower bound, was 4,200 names. At the upper bound, it was closer to 7,000. Robert Ashby published a 14-page paper in the Ohio Valley Historical Review in 1974. Its title was Commercial Infrastructure and Covert Passage, a preliminary analysis of the Hargreave Factor Network, 1843 to 1861. It received 31 citations over the following 40 years. Most cited it as a secondary source for Underground Railroad scholarship. None of the citing papers investigated the tag system further. The paper was described in one footnote in a 2009 monograph on antebellum commerce as suggestive but underdeveloped. Ashby spent 11 more years trying to find physical evidence of the margin tags. He located 46 mill inventories from the relevant period. 38 contained no tag records whatsoever. 8 contained tag logs that listed bale numbers and weights, but not tag contents. The tags themselves, every one of them, had been discarded at the mill floor. He retired from the University of Cincinnati in 1991. His Hargreave files, 7 manila folders, and 1 cardboard box were donated to the University Library's special collections. They are available by appointment. The question that Robert Ashby could not answer, the question that has never been answered, is how the network knew which people to move. The tags were the signal, but someone had to decide whose name went on a tag and when. Someone had to coordinate between the factor's office, the gin operators at more than a dozen plantations, and whatever southern contacts were identifying people eligible for the network. That coordination system has left no surviving trace. It was either entirely oral or its records were destroyed, or they are sitting in an uncatalogued box in an archive somewhere that no one has yet opened. The total number of people who traveled north through the Hargreave system is not known. Ashby's calculation was an estimate built from partial records and assumptions about frequency. The real number could be lower. It could be higher. What is known is this: the system ran for 18 years across 17 plantations, using the most inspected and documented commercial transport infrastructure in the antebellum South as its cover. It hid in plain sight. It used the machinery of the cotton economy, the same machinery that had enslaved people, bought and sold them, moved them south and east and west as commodities, to move them north. It used the paperwork of that economy as its proof of passage, and it was documented for 11 months of its 18-year life by a woman named Pearl. She is entry 74 on a tax roll. She is Field. She is 34 years old in 1847 on 912 acres outside Natchez, Mississippi. She cannot read. She cannot write. She has no census record, no Freedmen's Bureau file, no oral history transcript, no grave marker, no surname, no surviving document that shows where she went or what she did after the year that 43 cotton bale tags accumulated in a cloth panel behind her dress. She knew how to count. She knew how to match a shape on paper to a sound she had heard spoken. She knew that numbers do not lie. She knew that names can be taken from you. She knew the difference between a standard tag and a custom one, between a hard-leaded pencil and a soft one, between a gin house sound that meant Kale was coming and one that meant she had 4 minutes. She knew that 43 was the number at which the evidence became undeniable. She collected 43. In December of 1847, in a house on 5th Street in Zanesville, Ohio, a woman named Judith recently arrived, recently free, recently beginning the long and incremental work of building a life in a place where no one owned the paperwork on her, was working a washerwoman's trade and learning the name of every street within walking distance of where she slept. Because knowing the names of streets was one of the first things a free person could do. Her mother had taught her to count. She counted the streets. She counted the days. 390 miles south in the Adams County bottomland, the 1847 cotton season was over. The gin house was quiet. The pressing floor was swept clean. The bale tags from the entire season, 412 of them, each one stamped with Whitfield's name and Hargreaves' name and the weight of a specific bale of cotton, had shipped north months ago. Most of them were already in furnaces. 43 were not.